In the vast expanse of the Ottoman Empire, a shadowed and secretive system had emerged, one that would define the lives of countless boys brought into its fold. These were not ordinary children. They were chosen, taken from distant lands and obscure villages, often sold or kidnapped from the families who had no choice but to part with them. The reasons were manifold. Some sought wealth, others survival, and some were victims of fate, swept into a world whose rules they could scarcely comprehend. Their fate was sealed not by crime or ambition, but by the cruel edict of power. They would be castrated and transformed into eunuchs, stripped of their potential to live as ordinary men, and thrust into a labyrinthine life inside the imperial palace. The practice itself was deeply rooted in history, but under the Ottomans it reached an institutionalized scale. Eunuchs were prized for their perceived loyalty and absence of personal ambition that might threaten the Sultan's rule. To the Sultans, these boys were both tools and symbols. Tools to maintain order within the palace and harem, symbols of the reach and absolute authority of imperial power. They were trained, educated, and prepared for roles that demanded obedience above all else, their very existence a testament to the Sultan's ability to shape lives to his will. Families, particularly in frontier regions or subjected territories, were sometimes persuaded or coerced into giving up sons for service in the palace. The price, often paid in gold or promises of favor, could never compensate for the permanent loss and horror that awaited the child. The journey of these boys was rarely simple. They were often transported across vast distances, hidden away from prying eyes, and brought into a world of splendor and cruelty. Some were promised positions of influence, though few could imagine the true nature of what awaited them. Others were thrown into fear and confusion, the journey itself an initiation into a life of uncertainty and vulnerability. The very act of castration, performed by medical practitioners or slaves with rudimentary knowledge, was excruciating and dangerous. Death was common. Survival required not only physical resilience but a psychological adjustment to a new identity that erased what they had been. It was, in every sense, a transformation, one that demanded adaptation to a world defined by the whims of absolute power. Once inside the palace, the boys encountered a hierarchy that was both rigid and merciless. At the lowest level, they were servants, messengers, and attendants, tasked with menial work while their bodies and identities were being shaped to fit the palace's exacting needs. As they grew and proved their obedience, they could ascend to positions of greater responsibility, often in the harem, where they would manage women, control information, and enforce the Sultan's authority. This ascent, however, was never safe. Rivalries and intrigue were constant, and the smallest misstep could lead to humiliation, punishment, or death. The palace was a microcosm of the empire itself, a place where power was absolute and fear was constant, and the eunuchs were both participants and victims of this system. The social and psychological impact of this life was profound. Boys who had once dreamed of freedom or family were forced to internalize the limits imposed upon them, to navigate a complex world of expectation and surveillance. Friendships were tenuous, alliances fragile, and trust was a dangerous gamble. Many coped through subservience, while others developed cunning and strategy to survive within the brutal courtly hierarchy. Their youth was stolen, replaced by an acute awareness that their bodies and lives were instruments of power. The palace demanded complete conformity, and even small acts of independence could be punished severely. Yet within this darkness, some found ways to assert agency, however limited. They learned languages, memorized histories, and mastered the intricacies of palace protocol. Their intelligence and discipline sometimes allowed them to rise to positions of influence, where they could exert a form of soft power over the very sultans and officials who had once dictated their fates. The duality of their existence, oppressed yet occasionally empowered, defined the life of the eunuch in the Ottoman court. Their every action was a negotiation between survival and identity, a delicate balancing act that required constant vigilance. The story of the rise of the eunuchs is, therefore, not only one of cruelty and control but also of adaptation and resilience. These boys, stolen from their families and transformed into instruments of the empire, navigated a world of unimaginable beauty and terrifying oppression. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully men nor merely servants, and their lives reflected the complex dynamics of power, loyalty, and survival within the Ottoman Empire. The system that created them was harsh, unyielding, and often lethal. Yet it also shaped figures who would influence the empire in ways that were both visible and hidden. The rise of the eunuchs was not merely a historical footnote, it was a testament to the lengths a ruling power would go to maintain control, and to the endurance of human beings forced to survive under extraordinary circumstances. As the empire expanded, so did the network of eunuchs, their roles diversifying and their influence deepening. From administrative oversight to intimate access to the sultan, they became central to the machinery of power. Their presence was a constant reminder of the sultan's reach, a living embodiment of authority and fear. And yet beneath this veneer of utility and loyalty, the human cost was staggering. Each eunuch represented a stolen childhood, a life reshaped by pain and coercion, a story of suffering that history often ignores. These boys, silenced and constrained, bore witness to some of the most private and harrowing aspects of imperial life. Their experiences both personal and emblematic of the system that had claimed them. In this chapter of history, one sees both the mechanics of power and the intimate consequences of human cruelty. The rise of the eunuchs illustrates the intersection of political necessity, cultural practices, and personal suffering. Their lives were a blend of fear, service, adaptation, and occasional agency, a complex tapestry of human resilience woven against the backdrop of one of history's greatest empires. It is a story that challenges modern sensibilities, forcing a confrontation with practices that were once normalized, and reminding us that history is often shaped as much by the powerless as by the powerful. Once the eunuchs were inducted into the palace, their lives became a strict, regimented existence, dictated entirely by the intricate rhythms of court life. The sprawling Ottoman palaces, magnificent complexes of marble, courtyards, fountains, and ornate halls, were simultaneously spaces of wonder and cages of oppression. Every hallway echoed with whispers, every corridor was patrolled by watchful eyes, and every action was observed and judged. The boys who had once been children in distant villages now found themselves immersed in a world that was foreign in every sense, exotic, luxurious, yet terrifyingly constrained. They were at the mercy of a system designed to ensure the absolute dominance of the sultan, and their lives were defined by obedience, vigilance, and endurance. The early years inside the palace were the most difficult. The young eunuchs were assigned to specific quarters, often shared with others who had endured the same traumatic path. They were taught etiquette, palace protocol, languages, and literacy if they had not already received basic education. Discipline was harsh, with punishments for even minor infractions, verbal abuse, deprivation, or public humiliation. Many boys struggled to adjust to these conditions, grappling not only with the trauma of castration, but also with isolation, loss, and the impossibility of forming normal familial bonds. Loneliness was pervasive, and trust was a rare luxury. Those who survived the early years learned quickly that submission was not merely expected but necessary for survival. As they matured, the eunuchs were assigned specific roles that varied depending on talent, temperament, and the favor of their superiors. Some were positioned in the harem, managing the women, overseeing supplies, and acting as intermediaries between the sultan and the secluded quarters. Others worked in administrative roles, carrying messages, maintaining records, or managing the palace's complex operations. Every role required absolute discretion. Information was power, and a misstep could result in punishment or dismissal. The hierarchy was rigid but fluid, allowing for some advancement based on skill, loyalty, or cunning. Yet even those who attained positions of influence remained under constant scrutiny, aware that their lives hung in the balance with every decision they made. Life within the harem was particularly intense. The eunuchs who served there were exposed to the inner workings of the sultan's household, a world dominated by women of extraordinary influence and ambition. These eunuchs acted as enforcers, confidants, and spies, mediating disputes, delivering messages, and managing access. Their lack of sexual capacity was deemed an asset, allowing them to navigate these spaces without threatening the sultan's authority. Yet this very distinction made them objects of scorn and suspicion in some quarters. Relationships with the women were complex, based on negotiation, loyalty, and sometimes fear, but intimacy, in the human sense, was constrained by both social rules and the physical realities of their existence. Even beyond the harem, The lives of the eunuchs were shaped by isolation and surveillance. Friendships were fraught with danger. Alliances could shift, and betrayal was always possible. Yet, in this environment, some found ways to adapt, cultivating strategic relationships, learning to read moods and anticipate the desires of their masters. They became masters of observation, learning not only the formal rules but also the subtle currents of influence and manipulation that governed palace life. These skills allowed some to rise to unprecedented levels of authority, supervising vast networks of servants and officials, becoming indispensable to the Sultan and, in rare instances, wielding influence comparable to that of ministers and generals. The psychological toll, however, was immense. The boys were constantly reminded of their difference, their inability to live a normal life, and the permanent consequences of the procedures they had undergone. This enforced alienation created layers of trauma, with feelings of shame, anger, and helplessness embedded deeply within. Many found solace in small achievements, intellectual pursuits, or discreet camaraderie, but the pervasive atmosphere of fear and control made full emotional expression dangerous. The eunuchs were simultaneously respected, feared, and marginalized, living in a paradoxical state of powerlessness within a system that could elevate them to positions of extraordinary influence. The daily existence behind the palace walls was a careful negotiation between duty, survival, and the faintest glimpses of autonomy. Every act of obedience was calculated, every interaction weighed for potential risk or advantage. The eunuchs were both witnesses and participants in a world of immense wealth and intricate politics, where power was concentrated and cruelty was routine. Even mundane tasks carried layers of meaning. Delivering a message incorrectly could invite punishment. Attending a ceremony with insufficient decorum could provoke censure. Each day required constant vigilance, mental acuity, and an ability to suppress the personal instincts that might endanger survival. Yet despite the hardships, some eunuchs discovered ways to assert agency within the confines of palace life. Education became a tool of empowerment, and mastery of palace protocol allowed them to influence events subtly. Knowledge of secrets, alliances with influential figures, and careful manipulation of information were all methods through which eunuchs carved out spheres of control. In rare instances, this translated to significant authority, allowing them to shape decisions, protect allies, or even influence succession. Their existence became a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of those forced into circumstances beyond their control. Within the palace walls, time itself was distorted. Days blended into years, and childhood, adolescence, and maturity were marked not by personal milestones, but by service, obedience, and survival. The lives of the eunuchs were a study in contrasts. Immense responsibility paired with profound vulnerability, intimate access to power coupled with constant fear, enforced isolation alongside occasional influence. They lived in a liminal space, navigating complex hierarchies and intricate social structures, their identities forever shaped by a system designed to control, manipulate, and exploit. Ultimately, life behind the palace walls was both a prison and a crucible. It forged individuals capable of extraordinary skill, intellect, and subtlety, yet it demanded the suppression of fundamental human instincts and desires. The eunuchs' experiences illuminate not only the intricacies of Ottoman court life, but also the extreme human cost of a system that placed power and control above compassion and justice. Their stories are marked by endurance and adaptation, yet also by profound suffering, a duality that would echo through the remainder of their lives and leave an indelible mark on the history of the empire. Within the walls of the Ottoman palaces, the eunuchs were more than servants or administrators. They were instruments of the Sultan's absolute authority. Their proximity to power made them both invaluable and vulnerable, and in the shadow of that authority, the darker impulses of some sultans were unleashed. While not every ruler acted with cruelty, historical accounts reveal a spectrum of terror, psychological manipulation, and violent behavior directed toward these boys, whose lives were already defined by restriction and fear. The palace, dazzling in its splendor, concealed behind its gilded walls a network of horrors, a theater where power, paranoia, and sadism intertwined. Punishments could be swift and merciless. A mistake in the delivery of a message, a lapse in etiquette, or even a perceived act of insolence could provoke severe consequences. Some sultans employed methods designed to terrorize rather than merely discipline, knowing that fear was a tool to enforce obedience. Boys were subjected to beatings, confinement, and public humiliation, often in front of their peers to reinforce the hierarchy of power. The very architecture of the palace facilitated this system. Secluded chambers, hidden courtyards, and labyrinthine corridors ensured that no one could move without the possibility of observation. Every step carried a potential for danger, and the eunuchs quickly learned that survival depended not only on competence, but also on constant vigilance. Psychological torment was another weapon. Some sultans manipulated the eunuchs' sense of loyalty and identity, pitting them against one another, fostering jealousy, and exploiting their desire for recognition. A boy might be promised advancement or favor, only to have it revoked abruptly, leaving him demoralized and distrustful. Isolation was a common tactic, forcing the eunuch into reflection upon his own powerlessness, while simultaneously observing the sultan's absolute control. Over time, these manipulations could fracture the mind, leaving a permanent mark of insecurity and anxiety. The sultans understood that fear was more binding than affection, and the eunuchs, trained to obey, were rendered vulnerable to a host of cruelties both subtle and overt. Beyond punishment and manipulation, some sultans engaged in acts of cruelty that were both personal and arbitrary. Historical chronicles describe instances of physical abuse, harassment, and even humiliation for the sake of amusement or demonstration of power. Eunuchs were forced into degrading positions, stripped of dignity, and reminded constantly of their altered bodies and the permanent consequences of their castration. These acts were not universal but sufficiently documented to reveal the capacity for extreme cruelty within certain reigns. They were intended to enforce submission, to instill terror, and in some cases, to affirm the sultan's dominance in a manner that left no room for resistance. The eunuchs' proximity to the harem made them targets of both envy and suspicion. Those serving within this intimate space were constantly under scrutiny, expected to maintain discretion while navigating the ambitions and intrigues of powerful women. A misinterpreted action, a lapse in vigilance, or a mere glance could be construed as betrayal, leading to punishment from both the sultan and the women of the harem. This dual pressure amplified the psychological burden, forcing the eunuchs to develop extraordinary awareness of both social dynamics and human emotion. Their survival depended on mastering the subtle art of perception while suppressing their own instincts and desires. Yet even amidst this oppression, some eunuchs learned to wield the sultan's darker impulses to their advantage. They became adept at managing fear, navigating rivalries, and interpreting the moods of those in power. Some used the threat of reporting misdeeds, exposing secrets, or leveraging access to information to secure their own positions. In rare cases, eunuchs acted as intermediaries or advisors, shaping policy and influencing decisions behind the scenes. Their intimate knowledge of the palace, combined with their unique positions, gave them a form of power distinct from that of soldiers, viziers, or ministers, a shadow influence born of proximity, intelligence, and survival instincts honed under duress. The physical suffering endured by these boys cannot be understated. Castration itself was only the beginning. Subsequent punishments often involved beatings, confinement, or forced labor. Illness, injury, and exhaustion were common consequences of palace duties, and medical treatment was rudimentary at best. The vulnerability of their bodies, combined with the absolute authority of the sultan, created conditions in which suffering was normalized and survival required constant alertness. The eunuchs became both witnesses and victims of violence, existing in a state of perpetual tension between compliance and self-preservation. Many of these acts were shrouded in secrecy. The palace was an environment of discretion, rumor, and rumor management. Stories of abuse, humiliation, or murder often circulated quietly, leaving traces in chronicles, letters, and later historical accounts. The fear of exposure ensured that most suffering remained private, hidden behind walls that gleamed with opulence. Eunuchs, already isolated by circumstance and design, had few outlets to share their experiences, and the stories that did survive bear testimony not only to the cruelty of certain sultans, but also to the resilience and endurance of those who lived through it. Despite the horrors, some eunuchs adapted to the pervasive fear, transforming trauma into strategy. They became masters of palace politics, leveraging information, alliances, and subtle acts of defiance to maintain a fragile balance between survival and influence. Their existence illustrates the complex interplay between power and vulnerability, obedience and resistance, exploitation and cunning. The dark deeds of the sultans highlight the extremes of authority and cruelty, but they also illuminate the capacity of human beings to endure and maneuver within conditions designed to strip them of both dignity and autonomy. Ultimately, the relationship between the sultans and their eunuchs was a study in contrasts. It encompassed terror and dependence, punishment and protection, degradation and occasional empowerment. The eunuchs' lives were defined by proximity to absolute power, a closeness that allowed them to witness both grandeur and depravity. Their suffering was a constant reminder of the human cost of empire, a testament to the ways in which authority could reshape lives in permanent and often horrifying ways. The dark deeds of the sultans, as remembered in fragments of history, reveal a world in which power was exercised without restraint, and where the human spirit was tested in ways few could imagine, yet some endured, adapted, and survived. The lives of the eunuchs in the Ottoman Empire did not end with the sultans' whims, nor did the traumas they endured vanish with the passage of time. The legacy of their experiences lingered long after their youth had been stolen, shaping not only their own identities but also the intricate social and political fabric of the empire. These boys, who had been taken from their families, castrated and thrust into a world designed to exploit and control them, carried the marks of their suffering into adulthood. Yet within this legacy of pain, there existed resilience, adaptation, and a quiet form of survival that testified to the human capacity to endure unimaginable hardships. For those who survived the physical and psychological trials of the palace, life became a continuous negotiation of power, loyalty, and identity. Many eunuchs rose to positions of considerable authority, managing palace operations, overseeing the harem, and even influencing political decisions. Their unique status allowed them access to the inner workings of the empire in ways no ordinary official could attain. However, this influence was always tempered by the knowledge that it could be revoked in an instant. Every advancement, every expression of initiative, had to be carefully balanced against the risk of angering the sultan or falling victim to palace intrigues. Their lives were a delicate equilibrium between survival and assertion, autonomy and obedience. The psychological scars were perhaps the most enduring. Many eunuchs carried deep-seated feelings of shame, loss, and alienation. Their bodies had been altered without consent, their childhoods erased, and their potential for a conventional life, romantic, familial, or otherwise, forever denied. Relationships were shaped by caution and calculation. Intimacy, when it existed, was constrained by social norms, circumstance, and the impossibility of physical wholeness. Yet in spite of these limitations, some eunuchs forged meaningful bonds with others, finding solace in mentorship, intellectual companionship, or alliances built on mutual survival. These relationships became lifelines in a world where trust was scarce and betrayal was a constant threat. Education and skill became tools of empowerment. Eunuchs who excelled in languages, administration, and palace protocol could command respect and wield influence, often surpassing ordinary officials in their ability to navigate the complexities of court politics. Knowledge, observation, and subtlety were weapons as potent as the sultan's favor. These men, shaped by trauma and trained in the art of discretion, became indispensable to the operation of the empire. Their experiences illustrate a paradox. Those most constrained by oppression could, through intelligence and resilience, wield forms of power inaccessible to others. Yet even in these positions of authority, their pasts remained an indelible part of their identity, a constant reminder of the system that had created them. The social implications of the eunuch's existence were also profound. They occupied a unique space in the Ottoman hierarchy, acting as intermediaries between men and women, rulers and subjects, public and private spheres. Their presence affected the dynamics of power in subtle yet significant ways, influencing decisions, shaping alliances, and controlling information. In essence, the eunuchs became both agents and symbols of the empire's complex structures, demonstrating how individuals, even those constrained by physical and social limitations, could exert influence through intelligence, observation, and adaptation. Yet, for all their accomplishments, the shadow of the past was inescapable. Many eunuchs grappled with questions of identity, loss, and memory. The trauma of castration, separation from family, and childhood exploitation left emotional and psychological imprints that could not be erased. Some struggled with feelings of resentment or despair, while others turned their energies toward service, loyalty, or subtle acts of resistance. Their lives became a continuous effort to reconcile the horrors they had endured with the limited agency they had gained. Survival, in its fullest sense, was not merely physical but emotional and intellectual, a testament to human resilience in the face of sustained adversity. The historical legacy of these eunuchs extends beyond individual experiences. They serve as a reminder of the human cost of absolute power, of the ways in which political and social systems can manipulate, exploit, and erase the lives of the vulnerable. Their stories, often marginalized or omitted in broader histories, reveal the hidden dimensions of empire, the intimate suffering, the quiet strategies of endurance, and the complex interplay between oppression and agency. These men lived lives at the intersection of fear and influence, vulnerability and authority, cruelty and cunning, a duality that reflects both the extremes of imperial power and the resilience of the human spirit. Some eunuchs left legacies in the empire's political and cultural life. They patronized art, architecture, and learning, using their positions to shape culture and society. Others influenced succession, diplomacy, and governance, operating behind the scenes in ways that altered the course of history. Yet despite their achievements, the personal cost was immense, and the memory of childhood stolen and body-altered remained a silent companion. In reflecting on their lives, one sees a narrative that is both tragic and remarkable, a testament to the endurance of those who survived systems designed to erase their humanity, and to the subtle forms of power they carved out within impossible constraints. The stories of the eunuchs, finally, challenge modern readers to confront uncomfortable truths about history, power, and human suffering. They illustrate how individuals can be shaped, constrained, and exploited by systems far larger than themselves, yet still find ways to assert agency, resilience, and influence. Their lives are a prism through which we can examine the intersections of cruelty, survival, and human ingenuity. The Ottoman eunuchs' experiences, though specific to a particular time and place, resonate as universal accounts of endurance, adaptation, and the enduring consequences of historical injustices. In the end, the legacy of pain and survival is inseparable. These boys, transformed into eunuchs, became men who bore witness to empire, cruelty, and the fragile beauty of endurance. Their stories remind us that history is not merely the chronicle of rulers and battles, but also the account of those whose lives were shaped, often violently, by forces beyond their control. They survived, adapted, and in doing so, left a legacy that endures, a testament to the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity, and a haunting reminder of the costs of power wielded without restraint.